much of that. I can't control when the escalator works and when it doesn't work of life. And there are many things in life that are beyond my control. But there are always things in the midst of things that are outside of my control that are within my control. And because of that, that's why we want to talk about what we're talking about here today. And that's stepping forward when you feel stuck. When I was a kid, maybe about 10 years old or so, it was my birthday, and my birthday is in February, and February's not a great month to have a birthday party in because the weather, you may randomly get a nice day, but generally you're going to have nasty, mucky weather. And so I lived in a day when I actually did walk from school to home and back, and it was flat. It wasn't uphill. I won't make any grandiose stories about it. It was a flat walk the entire way, both ways, and it rarely snowed, so it was a good walk, but it was about 4 or 5 blocks from school to my house, and it was pretty much a straight shot out the front door of the school all the way to my house, except for one block. The first block, you had to walk around it, and then you hit the street, and you were a straight shot home. And so you had a choice. You could be respectful and walk around in the street, or you could be smart and just cut through the people's yard that was in front of you, because you could see the road. And so that was what I always did. I always just cut through these people's yard and walked around their garden in the backyard and hit the street, and away I went. Well, it was birthday day, and all of my friends from school were going to come home with me. And we were going to have a party. And all was going well. I'd gotten everybody together. We're journeying home. My friend Greg, though, wore his boots that day because it was kind of a nasty day. And Greg, for whatever reason, did not walk around the garden. Instead, he tried to go through the garden, and that did not go well. That began a bad evening for Greg because, again, it was one of those mucky days in February, and he began to step into the garden, and, of course, he began to sink into the garden. And lo and behold, it just does what mud does in a muddy day, and it just kind of grabbed a hold of his boots, and he was stuck. He was not going anywhere, and Greg, instead of just staying there and waiting for us to come help him, did the cardinal sin of being stuck in mud boots in the garden as he lifted his foot up. And when he did that, the boot stayed and his foot came out. And then you're doing the old flamingo thing, trying not to fall, which always goes poorly. And he ended up, by the time the rest of us were having a great time at my birthday party, he was muddy, cold, and wet. And it was just not a very happy birthday for Greg, birthday party for Greg that day. But his present made it to my house, I think. So it was okay. So, but I'm kidding. I love Greg. He was nice. And so anyway, I think of that every time I think of the word stuck, because I can picture that scene in my mind yet today of his boots stuck in the mud and us trying to get him out of there, get him home, and the muddy mess that he was because he got stuck. And so what do you do when you're stuck? Life brings moments like that regularly. Oftentimes it happens because the escalator, whatever the escalator is, stops. Maybe it's life transition. Maybe someone passes away. And all of a sudden you've been doing life this way, but all of a sudden now I'm stuck. What do I do now? What do I do? What's the next step? Or maybe your kids grow up and all of a sudden you thought you're going along fine this way, but you get to this stage and it's like, okay, what do I do now? Or maybe it's financial, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's relational, marriage, all kinds of things that we come to places in life where we feel stuck. And people have defined the idea of being stuck as that place in life where you feel frustrated, you're not sure what the next step is. There can be a sense of discouragement and depression and anger that comes because of it, and you're just in a place where you feel like you've put in some good planting. Maybe you've tried and you don't see fruit that you hope that you would see. You don't see the results. Your life isn't what you thought it would be, and so you're in this place and you think, okay, what is next? What's my next step? And we all end up feeling stuck at different times. And there's a question that I found as I thought about this topic this week that I found helpful that I want to share with you, and hopefully it helps you to think about this as I have as well this week. Last week, Jason Carmen did a wonderful job of sharing with us, and I appreciate that. But in the course of his talk, he talked about how Jesus was notorious when someone would ask him a question, instead of just giving the answer like they wanted, like we want, like Jesus, just tell me the answer. I don't want to have to think about it. I want the answer. But what would Jesus do? He's a good teacher. he would ask a question back. So Jesus, what about this? Well, what do you think about it? Well, I don't know. I'm asking you because I want to know what you think. And it got this frustrating thing going. And so there was constant questions that when Jesus was asked a question or brought an issue, he would ask a question instead of speaking a statement. And in doing so, I think there's a question that when you feel stuck, I think it's a helpful question that I came across this week and some things I listened to and read about that I hope will help you. It's not an easy question. In fact, it's a question that if you really dive deep into it, it'll mess with you. It will change you. It will begin to make you confront some uncomfortable things. It'll do some stuff in your life, but it's a good question to help you move on from stuck, okay? And so the question we'll get to in a second, but I want to illustrate what I said about Jesus asking questions. And there's like 3 or 4 of them in Scripture that different people who came to Jesus, and normally the need was pretty obvious. There was an issue in their life. They were sick, they were lame, they were something. It was pretty obvious to see what their need was. But Jesus would always ask the question anyway. And that when Jesus asked a question, it was rarely because of the superficial answer. Jesus was always trying to push it deeper. Jesus was always trying to push it from a physical level to a heart level. And so think of things like this. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 32, 2 blind men on the side of the road as Jesus and his entourage walk by, and they start calling out Jesus' name, and Jesus turns to them in verse 32 and says, Jesus stopped and called them, "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. It's a pretty no-brainer. They're blind. They want to see, and they've heard this guy can do that. And so, but Jesus asked the question, what do you really want me to do for you? Is that all you want me to do for you? Is there something deeper? Or is it just you want to see? What do you want me to do for you? James and John, 2 of Jesus' disciples, come to Jesus one day, and they have a request, and it's kind of a bold request. In fact, they're going to be asked for the prime seats in the kingdom. But the initial thing that Jesus asked them is, what do you want me to do for you? In Mark chapter 10. Here's the key question. John chapter 1, verse 38. 2 disciples who aren't really disciples yet. They're just kind of checking Jesus out, looking to see who he is. They've heard about him, he's done some great things. But they come to Jesus, and as they're following him, Jesus says this, that turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? And that's the question. That's the one, if you're going to write down a question, that's the question we're going to unpack today. What do you want? And we're going to unpack why that's a penetrating and helpful question here in a second. There's one more example of a text we're going to look at here today. In John chapter 5, verse 6, a lame man who has been that way for a considerable amount of his life is asked this question by Jesus, would you like to get well? That's kind of a strange question to a man who hasn't walked for 38 years. Would you like to get well? Well, of course, is what we think. But why does Jesus ask that question? Because Jesus is concerned about his ability to walk. But Jesus is far more concerned about the condition of his heart. And he wants to make that right before he makes anything else right. And so we're going to see that here today. But that's the question. Going back to that third question, what do you want? Now, we can ask that question from 2 perspectives, right? You can come at this from a humanistic kind of way. That self-help, our bookstores and Amazon's full of self-help books that use this question from a purely secular, non-God, faith-oriented perspective. What do you want out of life? That puts you in the captain's chair. What do you want to make life into? What do you want it to be? And lots of good books, helpful things, maybe flow out of that, can be helpful to your life. A good advice, maybe about your health. What do you want to be? And so there's all kinds of exercise workout videos that line my shelves at home that never get used. And so there are lots of self-help books, videos, all kinds of things that come from a purely secular, non-faith-oriented perspective. But you can also ask this question as Jesus asks it. Because Jesus is not asking from a secular point of view when he asks his disciples, what do you want? When he uses this question and related questions to it, he is asking from a very God-centered perspective. From God's perspective as a person of faith, what do you want? And I think that question helps us in a number of different ways. Because what it begins to make us think about, it leads us to ask and think about what would God's preferred future for me be? If I really put God at the center of that question, okay, I'm stuck in this situation in my life, in marriage, finances, in job, family, parenting, relationships, whatever it may be, leadership, all kinds of things. If I'm stuck, As a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, I think one of the most helpful questions I can ask is, okay, what do I want? Not what do I want, but because I'm a follower of Christ, what do I want my life to be about? And it begins I think that if we're stuck on the escalator to think, okay, the next step then would be this. If this is looking at my life from God's perspective, I open Scripture, I find these descriptions of these preferred futures for my life as a follower of Christ and the fruit that comes from being his follower, that's going to produce some things. And so what do I want from a heavenly perspective? It leads us to God's preferred future. It makes us ask the question, whose wants do I want most? Do I want my will to be done in my life? Or do I really want to be a person who surrenders what I want to what God wants for my life? It makes me ask the question, what do I need to do today that would most likely produce the fruit or the outcome that I want God to produce in my life? How can I cooperate with God today to make that happen? And maybe it asks us to wrestle with the question, what am I settling for? What am I settling for? What am I just not really following God into and just settling for second best or less than best in my life from God? And so what I want to do today is I want to read one of those stories from John chapter 5 where Jesus asked those questions. But I think as we read this story, is what you're going to find is that some of Jesus' words seem a little harsh. But I think what you're finding is that Jesus does care about his physical condition, but he cares far more about his spiritual condition by the end of this passage. So let's open up to John chapter 5. If you have a Bible, open there with me. If you have your Bible app, get that out and open up there. Let's unpack this, beginning in John chapter 5, verse 1. And we'll read through this quickly and just kind of unpack that whole theme here real quick. All right, John chapter 5, verse 1 and following says this. Afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, if you've ever seen a picture of the old temple that was in Jerusalem, this is near that setting, okay? There was a big pool that was the pool of Bethesda with 5 covered porches that were near it. And crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on these porches. Now there's a verse that sometimes some debate about whether it's in there, but it's a commentary that talks about why they were there. And they were there because there was this belief, at least a superstition, if not a belief, that this pool, which was spring-fed, and every once in a while the springs would stir the waters, and people believed that when they saw the waters being stirred, that was an angel, and the first person in the pool got well. And so, of course, whenever they saw the bubbles, whenever they saw the water stir, there was a mad rush to get in that pool first. Which the healthier you were, the more likely you were going to get there first. And so you had this place packed full of people built upon that superstition or that belief. Whether that happened or not, we're not told, but that was their thinking. Verse 5 goes on to say, one of the men lying there had been sick for, and note this, don't pass over this too quickly, for 38 years. That's a long time to suffer. It's a long time if he was lame to be lame. And so he had built up a life built around being lame. He had friends that would take him there, people that would care for him, people that would feed him, people that took care of him. And when Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, which is worthy noting, Jesus knew his condition and what was going on, he asked him, here's this weird question, you want to get better? You want to get well? Of course, Jesus, of course, but that almost sounds like a rude question. If you were a doctor, you walk into the hospital room and you're a patient, say, hey, you want to get better or not? I'll leave if you don't. And do you really want to get better? That's kind of a rude question in a way, from a certain perspective. But Jesus asked the question. And again, not because Jesus is trying to be rude or cold towards the man, but I think by the time you get to the end of this, he's trying to push this deeper. This is more than about your ability to walk. This is more than about your ability to be well physically. There's something deeper going on here. He goes on in verse 7, I can't, sir. He doesn't answer the question. He just says, look, the way to get well in my mind is I got to be the first in the pool, and I just can't do it, for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up. So someone else always gets there ahead of me. So I've been trying for a long, long time, Jesus, but this isn't working. And so Jesus told him, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. Instantly the man was healed. All right, so Jesus grants him what he really wants. And nobody else doesn't seem like is healed in that scene, but just this guy gets this blessing. And he's told to pick up his mat, which you'll find in the next verse introduces why. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath, which introduces the whole religious debate about what can you do on the Sabbath. And you're not supposed to carry your mat. You're not supposed to carry anything heavy. And so the Jewish leaders objected. In a fight, they begin to think, well, why are you breaking our laws? This wasn't the Old Testament law. It was a religious law that they were breaking. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat. But he replied, goes on, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. Who said such a thing as that? They demanded. The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. But afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him. Now, note this, okay? If you thought the first one was a little bit edgy, note what Jesus says here. Now that you're well, stop sinning or something worse is going to happen to you, okay? Hey, I'm glad you're better, but keep sinning, going to hell. That's even worse and more discouraging, all right? This isn't Jesus on a good day making everybody feel lovey-dovey, right? This is Jesus being brutally honest with a man whose desperate need, his first priority, he felt stuck in a situation where physically, I just can't get beyond this. And Jesus says, okay, your priority is physically to be well. My priority for you is spiritual wellness, because physical wellness comes and goes. Spiritual wellness lasts for eternity. And so Jesus is trying to drive this deeper. He's trying to steer a conversation from the superficial to the spiritual, to something much, much deeper. And so let's just think about being stuck in light of that little story, okay? Now, I'm not going to pick on this guy. We're not told a lot about him. I'm not going to pick on him very much. But I do want to highlight a couple of things that maybe if we were to use his life as an example, that I think there's some parallels between his life and our life as well. I was listening to a podcast earlier this week. A former person I knew from my days in college, Stan Rada, was doing something, and he said a phrase in the midst of listening to that struck me, and I didn't agree with it at first. And he talked about being stuck, and he said this, that sometimes most of us like to be stuck. Now, you read that, it's like, no, I don't. I hate being stuck. That's the most frustrating, discouraging places in my life when I feel like I'm stuck in a place, right? None of us like to do that. But then he went on to explain that, well, then how do you explain those situations in life when you know you're stuck and you know the right thing to do, right? Your health is not what it's supposed to be, all right? But yet, what's for supper? Pizza and soda, right? With those two things, I know the truth, but I'm stuck, but I'm not doing it, right? And again, I'm having pizza and soda for lunch, so I'm not coming down on anybody who's having pizza and soda, okay? Because it's coming, all right? And so, but yet, there's a difference. Sometimes we are quite comfortable with being stuck in a situation. Relationally, we can become quite comfortable in a broken situation because it's what we know, or it's just we don't want to face some of the stuff that we know is probably going to happen if we really try to make it better or different. And so it really stirs up some things. And he went on in the course of talking, using this guy as an example, to talk about some of the payoffs versus the costs for this guy. Again, we're not picking on this guy, but just using him as an example as a parallel to our own lives. But there were some payoffs. There were some things that came into this guy's life that made it less attractive when Jesus asked the question, do you want to get well? There were some good things that came because of his disability. Things like he had a faithful group of friends. There was probably people that he was at that pool with every day that let's say he'd been there for 10, 20 years trying to do this. He knew people. There's a relational circle that he was comfortable with. Maybe another payoff is you don't have to work. He had people that would take care of him. He had friends who would feed him, make sure he got there, make sure he got home, make sure he was taken care of. That was a good thing, all right? There were no bills, didn't have a lot of pressure put upon him to do great things in life. He got sympathy. There were people to be very sympathetic towards him in his condition. There were no big decisions. He didn't have to wrestle with a lot of those kind of things. Something to complain about. This is kind of a more personal, goes a little deeper here. Have you ever enjoyed your ailments or your problems because it draws sympathy and you're able to kind of lean into that and hide behind that instead of fixing something? We can see that whole statement that misery loves company. That's a true statement. Man, if we start just talking about our ailments and our complaints, that's a long conversation because we could complain all day and we'll feel pretty good about it because everybody's got misery and everybody's got things. And so those are all things that came into his life that when Jesus asked the question, do you really want to get well, that he had to wrestle past. And so those are payoffs, but think about the costs. What did it cost him because he stayed stuck? Well, his life had no adventure. His life was predictable. There was no new challenges, no opportunities. He knew what his day was every day. Ask him, what are you going to do tomorrow? Could go lay by the pool and hope I'm the first one in. There was no adventure in his life, and it cost him that. That was a cost. It was a cost for meaningful work. While it was a good thing for him to be there trying to help himself, there was probably a discouraging part of him that says, I wish I could get up and I could go do something meaningful. I wish I could produce something or make something or be a part of something, but I can't. As a guy who likes to mow his yard, my work is not a work that I can just leave at 5 o'clock and everything's done in an order, because the old joke about the mortician he used to be a preacher, but he switched to being a mortician, and somebody asked him, which one do you like more? He says, well, I like being a mortician because when I straighten them out, they stay straight now. So that's a joke. Anyway, something that's yeah. Anyway, so there you go. You're welcome. You can use that at the coffee shop later. And so my job isn't like that, right? It's constantly something else, and that's okay. That's a great thing. That's a fun part of it. But where was I going with that? When I mow my yard, when I mow my yard, there's a great sense of satisfaction to that because I mow it, it looks nice, it's done, it's fixed, right? And it's not going to disobey me, it's not going to disappoint me, it's just going to be mowed and it's done, and I can look at it for a few days until it has to be mowed again, right? There's something good about that. So again, this guy, one of the costs from being stuck for him was he didn't have that, and that was a hard thing. Mobility, he couldn't get up and go. Friendships, he could have built more. Again, the ability to go and to be and to do cost him, could have produced more friendships. Intimacy, again, it's hard because of where he was stuck at to have those intimate relationships. And probably the biggest thing was purpose. It's like, what is my life about? My life is about going and laying by a pool. When Jesus made him well, he opened up a brand new world for him to be able to have a purpose to his life. And so, again, it's just you think about being stuck, and all of us are there. All of us wrestle with that sometimes. And we have to really ask ourselves the question, if we were to paraphrase Jesus, do I really want to be unstuck? Do I really want to move forward in my life? And sometimes the answer, if I'm honest, is no, I don't. I don't like the thought of having to confront things I'm doing wrong. I don't like the thought of having to change. Nobody likes change, except 2% of the population. Nobody likes change. Nobody likes to have to be different or to have hard conversations or to try to learn something new or be different. Those aren't fun things. We say we want to be different, but the path there, the next step sometimes is a scary one. And so not always do we want to be well. And so where are you stuck at? There are payoffs and there are costs when you decide to take that next step up the escalator that has stopped. When you think, okay, no longer am I going to sit here, I'm going to take a step. And maybe that is scary, maybe it is uncertain, maybe it's a whole new world. It could be a lot of different things that happen. And so sometimes people ask the question of ourselves, I live in bitterness because of something that's done to me. And well, do you really want to forgive that person? No, because I live off that negative energy. I live off that, and that drives me. It's not a healthy way, but it drives me. Do you want to take your marriage to the next step? Parenting. Do you want your ability to do your job, to learn and to grow and to be your best for God in that role? And so what Jesus is driving at in this passage is the will, right? He's saying, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to go along this path? Do you want to be healed? And so it goes back to the question that we began with. If we're going to maybe move beyond stuck, I think some questions that I just want to finish with here that maybe can help us as you jot these down and maybe just think on them on your own, maybe talk about them with a good friend and just talk about these together or just on your own with God. 3 questions. Number 1, just identify where you're stuck at. Ask God to say, God, in my heart of heart, there are areas I am frustrated, I am discouraged because I just feel stuck in this place in my life. And so, God, I need to be honest, and I need to find those. I need to see those, because those, if I feel stuck, that's producing a negative vibe. It's producing a drag and a frustration in my life. And so I need to be honest with God about that, because that's an important first step. Number 2, here's the question we looked at earlier. What do you want? Again, spending time, God, in this area, in my marriage or my finances or in my life, in my walk with you, I just feel stuck. And so what do I want? And again, look at that question, not with you in the captain's chair, but with God in the captain's chair, with Christ there. Say, Christ, if you are Lord of my life, what do I want? Because that really brings up the question of, well, Jesus wants me to be this, I want to be this, and I have to decide which am I going to be? What do I really want for my life? Do I want to be Christ's or just want to live for myself? I have to decide that. Number 3, what are you pretending not to know? And where are you lying to yourself? Now you think, well, I'm not lying to myself. I am. I do it regularly, right? Sometimes my pants get tight. I think, well, why is that? The dryer must be acting up. Well, it could be because I drink 3 sodas a day and I eat pizza for lunch. And it could be those kinds of things that I know better, but I lie to myself when I say, well, I can do this without consequences, but I can't do that. Life is very consistent that way, that oftentimes the fruit that we reap is the fruit that we sow, or the seeds that we sow. And so where are you lying to yourself? Be honest. Again, that's a conversation. It doesn't happen quickly, but as you begin to drill down into those questions, what you find is that God begins to show you things. And he begins to maybe not show you a whole path, but here's a step. Here's a step. Here's a step. And here's a step. And all of a sudden you begin to move from stuck, and maybe change begins to happen. It may feel not like good change at first, but it's change. And God uses that to grow us and stretch us. And so what I want to encourage you to do is, if you feel like your life in certain places is an escalator that has stopped working, you need to take a step. Don't just sit there and wait, but take a step. This past week, I was at camp on Tuesday, and for all the rain, and so we were talking about Noah on Monday, and the joke at camp on Tuesday was we should have built the ark yesterday when we talked about Noah on Monday, because we needed it on Tuesday before we got washed away from camp. But I saw pictures from Versailles of flooding that happened, and a rescuer who came to save a family, I believe, if I got my story straight. And I just like that picture, because I think when you think about being stuck in any place in your life, one of the best things that happens when a rescuer comes along, right? You're stuck in floodwaters, you're stuck in a snowbank, you're stuck in life, and this rescuer comes along and says, hey, let me help you out. And that's a cool thing. And I think that's a perfect parallel to who Jesus is. Wherever you feel stuck, wherever it is that you feel like, man, I just don't know what the next step is, that's where your rescuer steps in and says, hey, let me give you a hand. But there's a second part to that. You have to reach out and take the hand. You have to be willing to cooperate with the will of the rescuer. I can sit in my car and hold on to the steering wheel and say, no, I'm not going, because it's a lot more comfortable here in the car for the time being. I'm not going out there where the dangerous floodwaters are. That's scary to me. I'm going to stay right here where it's comfortable. But rescue is out the window. And so you and I have a choice. Yes, Jesus has done all that he can to come to you as a rescuer, but he asks for you then to cooperate, to go with him, to follow him, to let him be the leader in your life, to bend your will to his. And so, feeling stuck, reach out, follow the hand of your rescuer. Would you pray with me, please?